Werner von Braun went from meetings with Hitler about Germany's V-2 wonder weapon, a weapon built with concentration camp labor, to one of the lead architects behind Apollo 11 in less than 20 years. His move from high-ranking Nazi to American celebrity began with a single typo. How should we treat an ex-Nazi? Should science and technology overlook someone's background if their most visible accomplishment is inspirational? It seems like a dumb question. Of course, people should be held responsible for literal war crimes, but history would suggest that, under the right circumstances, we're comfortable turning a bit of a blind eye. Von Braun is absolutely a unique case, but his story raises questions of morality in technology, something that's very relevant in our increasingly technological society. I also wanted to make this video because every time I bring up Von Braun, my comments explode with people explaining his backstory or arguing that he wasn't really a Nazi, so I think it's worth doing a good historical deep dive. Let's unpack Werner von Braun as a fascinating figure in history and a case study. We're going to look at his early life, wartime activity, fame in America, and how his image only became tarnished after death. But before we start, hi, I'm Amy. I forget to introduce myself all the time on my own channel. If you're new here, I'm an author and historian, and I've done a ton of digging into Von Braun over the years, mostly for my first book, Breaking the Chains of Gravity, which tells his story as it relates to NASA's roots, but doesn't really get into the moral side. I've written about that element elsewhere, but I've been wanting to do a thorough look for a while. Also, my book has a lot more on the technical side of his early rocket tests, so if you're into that history, I've got you covered. Also, my German accent is terrible. Please refrain from commenting on it. I studied German for years and I always struggled with the accent. Alright, that said, let's dive in. In the early 1920s, anyone experimenting with rockets was considered a weirdo fringe scientist, the term scientist usually carrying heavy quotation marks. The rockets of the era used compressed black powder, a mix of charcoal, sulfur, and potassium nitrate that burned once lit and couldn't be controlled more than angling the whole tube to direct the thrust that lasted as long as there was powder to burn. The reaction was powerful, and physicists saw that it had potential, but unless that power could be tamed and controlled, there were limits to how far rocketry could go. In 1923, physicist Hermann Oberth published a short book called Die Rakete zu den Planeten, or The Rocket into Planetary Space. It was the first academic discussion of liquid propulsion, rockets that burn liquid fuels, the rate of which can be adjusted so the rocket can fly with more or less power as needed. The book changed the game for those fringe scientists, a group of whom met in the back parlor of an alehouse in Breslau in June of 1927 with the goal of bringing Oberth's rockets to life. They called themselves the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, or VFR, the Society for Space Travel. Progress was slow but steady. In 1929, one of its members, Rudolf Nabel, secured funding from the government-sponsored Reich Institute for Chemistry and Technology. That funding allowed the group to draw Oberth into the fold and recruit two new engineers, a mechanical engineer named Klaus Riedel and a 17-year-old student from the Berlin Institute of Technology named Werner von Braun. The Prussian-born von Braun was described as handsome with blue eyes, light blonde hair, and manners that spoke to a noble upbringing. His father, Magnus, was a civil servant and conservative politician, and his mother, Emmy, could trace her lineage to European royalty. Werner spoke French, played piano, and politically held the opinion common among members of the German noble class. The German Republic was no good, and the Nazis were ridiculous. In the fall of 1930, Rudolf Nabel found the VFR a permanent home at an old ammunition dump in Berlin's northern suburb of Reinickendorf. Christened the Raketenflugplatz Berlin, it was a grassroots undertaking. Members bartered engineering work for materials or food. They relied on generous family members. They did public demonstrations to raise money, but their success rate was low. In a stroke of good luck, one of their demonstrations caught the attention of a film company that produced a newsreel about their work, and that reel caught the attention of the German army. The German army's interest in rockets is significant for this history. Most countries had abandoned rockets as military weapons decades earlier because those black powder rockets that I just talked about made for unwieldy and imprecise cannons that, by the turn of the 20th century, were far inferior to newer, lightweight artillery and the introduction of flight. In the First World War, planes were used to scout ahead of ground troops. Then crews in those reconnaissance planes started carrying guns to fire on enemy armies, and before long they were shooting at enemy planes. Guns were eventually mounted on the fuselage so pilots could shoot and aim while flying. The German Fokker Aircraft Company debuted the interrupter gear that ensured automatic weapons always fired between the propeller blades so bullets wouldn't rip up the blades or ricochet back and hit the pilot. The era of aerial dogfighting was born. Germany lost the war, and the Treaty of Versailles, which enforced the war's end, limited the German military to forestall a new conflict. Part of the terms was demobilization of flying personnel with no more than 1,000 men in Air Force positions, and all vehicles and supporting infrastructure were forcibly surrendered to the governments of the Principal Allied and associated powers. But the Treaty of Versailles didn't say anything about rockets. They hadn't been used offensively in the Great War. So when the Army's Chief of Ballistics and Ammunition, Colonel Karl Becker, ammunitions expert Major Ritter von Harsteg, and Chief of the Army's Powder Rockets Development Captain Walter Dornberger arrived at the Raketenflugplatz one spring day in 1932, they were after a way to rearm the country without blatantly violating the terms of the treaty. The Army men weren't hugely impressed by the ragtag group, but recognized there was talent among its members, specifically Werner von Braun. Becker offered the VFR Army sponsorship just to get von Braun, but the group refused, citing their preference of space exploration over weapons. So Becker made von Braun a separate offer: develop liquid rockets for the Army at its site, Kummersdorf West, with full support and get a doctorate. Becker was faculty at the University of Berlin, so could arrange for von Braun's military reports to stand in for a dissertation. Von Braun accepted and began his Army career at just 20 years old on October 1st, 1932. So surely von Braun knew what taking an Army position would mean, right? Maybe not. Remember that von Braun came from a conservative Prussian aristocratic family. He was a baron, and a military career wasn't uncommon. And look what he's getting. At 20, he has military funding for his passion and a free PhD. It was also 1932. Adolf Hitler had lost the presidential election that year to incumbent Paul von Hindenburg, whose term was set at 7 years. Even though the Nazi Party had strong support, there was no indication anything would drastically change. Von Braun had an incredible opportunity. He took it. Other members of the VFR gradually filled out the ranks of the Army's new liquid propulsion rocket program led by Walter Dornberger. Their first offering was the Aggregate 1, or the A1, that represented a new way of doing things. At the Raketenflugplatz, the team put their rocket's engines in the nose with the fuel tanks behind it, similarly to how a car's engine is in front. Robert Goddard, working reclusively on liquid propulsion in the United States at the time, used a similar arrangement, which is just to say that it was common. With the A1, they reversed the arrangement, putting the engine below the fuel and oxidizer tanks when the rocket was standing vertically. They realized that as rockets got bigger, the engine had to be the lowest element to prevent the hot exhaust from incinerating the fuselage. The A1 was thus the first rocket that looks like something we recognize: a giant artillery shell 1 foot or 0.3 meters in diameter, 4.6 feet or 1.4 meters long, with an 85-pound or 38.5 kilogram flywheel in the nose to keep it stable. It was not stable. The flywheel made it nose heavy, and the only test ended with an explosion on the launch pad. So the team moved on to the A2, which was identical except the gyroscope was moved to the center of the rocket's body. 2 A2s named Max and Moritz after popular cartoon characters launched just before Christmas in 1934. They worked and brought an influx of funding that let the team move on to the A3. By this point, the political landscape in Germany was changing. After the First World War, the position of chancellor was appointed by the president, but when multiple elections failed to form a majority, Hindenburg gave in to pressure and appointed Hitler to the post in January of 1933. The Nazi Party got 2 other ministers in the cabinet, and Hitler moved fast to make it so that only Hindenburg had the authority to remove him from the government. Also in 1933, von Braun joined the SS Heißsturm at Berlin-Halensee, an SS-sponsored equestrian unit. He was discharged the following year. He also got his doctorate. Both these things suggest he had a pretty good idea of what was happening in his country. To join an SS group, he'd have proved there were no racial aliens in his lineage. As a student at the Institute of Physics at the University of Berlin, he would likely have known Jewish professors were being forced out of their positions or heard of Jewish students withdrawing. Historian Michael Neufeld also mentions that in the 1920s, von Braun went to school with a number of Jewish children, so likely knew members of the community. Like many German scientists and engineers, von Braun was likely pseudo-apolitical and distant from party politics in principle, but as Neufeld says, a right-wing nationalist in reality. Both his upbringing and army sponsorship would have led him to a sort of pro-German neutrality. In the summer of 1934, President Hindenburg got sick. Uncertain about Germany's future should he die in office, Hitler had the cabinet enact the law concerning the head of state of the German Reich on August 1st. Upon the president's death, the presidency would be abolished and its powers merged with the office of the chancellor. Hindenburg died the next day, and Hitler consolidated his power, becoming Führer and Reichskanzler, leader and chancellor of the Reich. The Nazi Party took control of the country's assets, including its military. Hitler reintroduced conscription to fill out the military with 500,000 troops, well in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, all of whom now swore obedience to him rather than pledging to defend the country. The new army, the Heer, took over Dornberger's group, and the Luftwaffe took notice. Its head, Hermann Göring, wanted rockets for airplane propulsion. The two services joined forces and began constructing a new research facility on the island of Usedom near the village of Peenemünde. It had space, privacy, and access to the Baltic for test launches. In 1937, von Braun and Dornberger were its first residents. Von Braun also got a promotion that year to technical director, but it came with a catch. He had to pledge his allegiance to the Reich. If he didn't, he would have to abandon his work. He joined the Nazi Party on May 1st. Von Braun joining the Nazis feels like he's happy with, or at least happily ignoring, what's happening, because Hitler is making his intentions very clear. In 1936, he sent troops to occupy the demilitarized Rhineland, and while Britain and France condemned the action, neither intervened. At home, the Hitlerjugend, or Hitler Youth, had grown to include an astounding 5.4 million boys between the ages of 10 and 18, a group that fed members right into the SS, the muscle behind the Nazi regime built on volunteers who believed in the cause. Von Braun might have been happily ensconced in the little bubble of his work surrounded by a positive pro-German narrative. He clearly didn't mind joining the party to retain his position. He might have been swayed by the idea that a stronger military could mean more funding. At the end of the day, von Braun's main focus was the A3 and Peenemünde. The first rocket flew from the island site in December of 1937 while a boatload of dignitaries watched. It was a disaster. The water-soluble paint on the rocket's body melted from condensation on the fuel tank, shorting the electrical system and delaying the launch. After a quick fix, it flew only to reveal a misaligned guidance system. It flew into the wind, so when the parachute deployed for landing, it was forced into the path of the exhaust, rendering it useless. The rocket crashed into the Baltic. The A3 was a dud, so von Braun and Dornberger moved on to the next variant. The A4 was earmarked as the first production rocket for the Army, so the A5 was their next testbed. But soon there was a new problem. The Luftwaffe dropped out of Peenemünde, leaving the Army to foot the bill alone. And it looked like the rocket would be requested sooner rather than later. On March 12, 1938, after a prolonged propaganda campaign, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss. 8 months later, on the night of November 7th, a 17-year-old Jewish teenager killed a counselor at the German embassy in Paris. This became the rationale behind an organized wave of violent anti-Jewish pogroms throughout Germany and German-occupied lands 2 days later. Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, ended the following morning with some 20,000 Jews rounded up and carted out to the first concentration camps. Germany's aggression was getting harder to ignore. On March 23, 1939, Werner von Braun's 27th birthday, Hitler arrived at Kummersdorf West. Hitler had been in power for 6 years. Dornberger had been head of the Army's rocket development for 9. It was the first time the men met. Dornberger and von Braun gave Hitler and his entourage a tour of the facility, showed a cutaway model of the A3, and did a static fire test. Hitler seemed distant and unimpressed. He just wanted to know how soon the A4 could be ready and how far it could travel. Both von Braun and Dornberger felt they hadn't done enough to impress Hitler and secure more funding. But the question was fast becoming, could a war change that? Hitler declared war on Poland on September 1st, 1939, though the aggression he used as his rationale was really an attack faked by the Nazi government. In October, von Braun and Dornberger had an A5 ready to launch, and it's worth mentioning that the rockets were getting bigger. This one stood 21.3 feet or 6.5 meters tall and 2.6 feet or 0.8 meters in diameter with a 3,300-pound thrust engine in its base. On its first launch, the A5 rose and followed a straight trajectory before disappearing into the clouds. Once the fuel was spent, von Braun released the parachutes remotely and watched, alongside Dornberger, as the rocket appeared on time. It fell softly into the Baltic in such good condition that if it hadn't been waterlogged, they could have relaunched it. Hitler remained unimpressed. He wanted a weapon he could use now. In February of 1940, he ordered all weapons not ready for combat be struck from the priority list. Work at Peenemünde limped along on meager funding. Hitler might not have seen the potential of the A5, but the SS did. It wanted a foothold for control of the rocket program, and it wanted von Braun to be a member. On the 1st of May 1940, Colonel Miller arrived in von Braun's office on behalf of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, chief of the Gestapo, and the man behind concentration camps. Miller had orders for von Braun to join the SS, but von Braun rebuffed the colonel, saying he was too busy to take on a volunteer position. Miller insisted that joining wouldn't demand a significant time commitment and tried to sweeten the pot by offering von Braun the immediate rank of Untersturmführer, or lieutenant. Von Braun asked for a few days to consider and immediately shared his concern with Dornberger. Refusing the SS would likely see him forced out of the rocket program and banished to a work camp. Dornberger agreed. Von Braun's desire to continue his rocket work won, and less than 2 weeks later, he became an SS lieutenant. Work pressed on at Peenemünde, and on June 13, 1942, a 47-foot or 14.3 meter tall, 5.5-foot or 1.6 meter diameter rocket rose off the launch pad. Von Braun watched as nearly 10 years of work came together in this first successful A4 flight. And so did Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect turned Minister for Armaments and War Production. The rocket veered off course and crashed. A second launch on August 16th was dogged by a faulty guidance system. A third flight on October 3rd was flawless. The A4 worked. In late 1942, Heinrich Himmler arrived at Peenemünde. He told Dornberger that quite a few people in Hitler's inner circle were interested in the A4 because it wasn't just the army's rocket anymore. The German people needed it for protection against the Allies, Himmler said, and since it was a war weapon, he wanted some of his people to keep an eye on the base. Dornberger balked at the idea of an SS presence at Peenemünde and suggested they take over security in the nearby town instead. Himmler agreed and left with a promise to return soon. Return he did on June 28, 1943. The visit started socially with dinner, von Braun and Dornberger among the attendees. Afterwards, the group moved on to drinks and, inevitably, talk about rockets. Von Braun waxed poetic about his desire to see his rockets exploring space and admitted he felt the war was destined to end badly for Germany. The next day, Himmler watched one A4 explode on the launch pad and another fly well. He left impressed, and von Braun soon got an invitation from Hitler to give a presentation about the A4 at the Army's guest house in East Prussia. At this second meeting, Dornberger and von Braun finally impressed Hitler. This time, the Fuhrer had pointed questions. Could the payload capability be increased to 10 tons? How many rockets could Peenemünde produce each month? He granted the A4 the priority status Dornberger had long coveted. He also asked for 2,000 A4s every month, a figure well beyond Peenemunde's own means. Hitler brushed away concerns, saying they'd have money to build factories and gain a workforce now. Of course, by workforce, he meant slave labor. Peenemünde was already using slave labor. Around the time of Himmler's visit, the first 600 of an eventual 1,300, mostly French and Russian prisoners, were put to work setting up production machinery to build the rockets. The chain of command that put slave labor at the site sidestepped von Braun. He wasn't involved in production, just development, so he wouldn't have been part of the decision, though he certainly knew it was happening. There was another group interested in von Braun's rockets, the Allies. It started with rumors. The anonymous Oslo letters delivered to a British attaché mentioning Peenemünde, Danish fishermen seeing objects streaking across the sky, the Polish underground, and German prisoners of war mentioning seeing what looked like rockets. British aerial photography ultimately confirmed that there were long-range missiles on Usedom. On the night of August 17th, the Allies bombed Peenemünde, but they missed the leader's housing building that was their main target. The lead plane's radar hadn't been working, and his visual navigation was off because of clouds. So while von Braun and Dornberger woke to the sound of bombs, anti-aircraft guns, and fire, they had time and the presence of mind to save their work. Von Braun ran into a collapsing building to get key documents from his office, carrying them out and throwing them out windows. Dornberger saved guidance, control, and telemetry data. The raid also told Hitler that the Allies were scared of the A4, which confirmed his idea that it was Germany's best chance to win the war. He granted the program more funding and protection. Hitler ordered A4 production moved underground. The new site, a disused mine in the Harz Mountains, was called Central Works Limited, or Mittelwerk, to mask its true purpose. For security, he decreed that only concentration camp labor could be used. On August 20th, Hitler made Heinrich Himmler his new Minister of the Interior, which put him in charge of organizing the new A4 factory and gave the SS a stronger foothold in the program. Himmler brought in Hans Kammler to set up the new camp to feed labor into the factory, and von Braun would have been part of the slave labor moving to the new facility. In the days after the raid, he chaired a meeting at Peenemünde wherein leadership discussed moving the SS prisoners from the nearby production plant to the underground site. It's the first time, or at least the first time that historians can be sure, that he was party to the inhumane conditions that were part of his program. And this wouldn't be the first time. He knew it was a common practice and was, at the very least, party to the administration allowing such conditions. Trainloads of prisoners soon arrived at the mountain site from Buchenwald and started widening and extending the mine's tunnel. As more trainloads arrived, bunks were added to the cave, which had neither ventilation nor sanitation. Prisoners drank what water they could find on the floor and ate the meager food that barely kept them alive. Disease ran rampant and death was frequent. During the winter of 1943 into 1944, an average of 20 prisoners died every day. The camp supplying the labor was named Dora, and one survivor said years later that Dora made Auschwitz look easy. When Dora became too crowded, a second camp was built called Nordhausen. 4 A4s were built at Mittelwerk before the end of 1943, and it was immediately obvious that forced labor by unskilled workers produced a flawed product. The A4s coming out of Mittelwerk couldn't fly. They were so poorly made and, more often than not, sabotaged. The prisoners didn't know what they were building, but they knew that peeing on an electric component could ruin it without leaving signs. Hitler maintained that slave labor was the path to success. Himmler maintained that the SS controlling the A4 was the path to success. In early 1944, Himmler called von Braun to his office and offered the engineer a chance to join his own staff. Von Braun, who had been receiving yearly promotions with the SS, refused. He said he was loyal to Dornberger and the army. A month later, on March 22nd, the night before his 32nd birthday, von Braun woke to find Gestapo officers hammering on his door. He wasn't under arrest, the officers told him. They were just putting him under protective custody. 3 more members of his team were similarly collected that night, including his younger brother Magnus. The 4 men were put in individual cells as their protective custody stretched into weeks. Himmler was punishing von Braun for his refusal to hand the A4 over to the SS, though the official reason was because von Braun was giving peacetime projects precedence over wartime production tasks. Himmler decided that von Braun's social talk of spaceflight was akin to disloyalty bordering on treason. Dornberger successfully secured the men's release, though it meant appealing to Albert Speer, who took the issue to Hitler, saying the whole A4 effort would be sunk if von Braun stayed in jail. Hitler eventually agreed to their release, adding that von Braun was to be protected only so long as he is indispensable. It's here that von Braun has a moment of clarity, and it's possibly the most important moment in his story. He realized that he wasn't safe, even as valuable as he was. At this point, he started living a dual life. Publicly, he was a dutiful soldier of the fatherland, voluntarily wearing his SS uniform for the first time and devoting himself to the A4. Privately, he looked for opportunities and kept a trunk of documents packed in case he needed to run. He also started formulating his post-war plans, all of which centered around getting to America. He figured America was the likeliest victor in some future war, and he thought it would be nice to be on the winning side. When the Allies landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, it marked the beginning of the end for Germany. As more than 100,000 Allied soldiers were making their way toward Berlin, Hitler promoted Himmler to head of the Home Army. Because Dornberger's group reported to the Home Army, he now reported to Himmler, and Himmler finally had control of the A4. On August 8th, Himmler appointed Hans Kammler as special commissioner for the program, giving him the power to deploy it in the field. There was nothing Dornberger could do. As soon as that weapon launched, he and von Braun would be guilty of a new set of war crimes. The pace picked up at Mittelwerk, where mass hangings became the norm. Records say that von Braun visited the factory in the second half of 1944, so why didn't he say anything? Michael Neufeld points out that von Braun could have lodged a written complaint saying that healthier workers would make for healthier rockets, but he probably knew that any criticism would have landed him in a striped uniform. We're also, to borrow a modern phrase, in von Braun's post-arrest era. A lot of the things he let slide he could justify, as much as to himself as to someone else, that he was acting out of fear and self-preservation in an increasingly volatile situation. I've always said that self-preservation is the most charitable way to read his actions, but given the situation, it might be the truth. In late 1944, with the Allies occupying a sizable portion of northern France and pressing ever closer to the German border, Hitler ordered rocket bombardment. On September 8th, one group launched an A4 from Houffalize in Belgium at 8:34 in the morning. It landed 180 miles or 290 kilometers away near the Port d'Italie in France. A second group launched another rocket at 6:48 that evening and hit the London suburb of Chiswick. The team at Peenemünde learned about the launches from the newspaper headlines. Vergeltungswaffe 2 gegen London im Einsatz. Vengeance Weapon 2 in action against London. It was christened V2 by Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. News of the V2 carried different weight to the Americans who read about the attacks. The country was safe from the rocket, but it was clear that Germany could challenge America for air superiority in the future. To avoid being on the receiving end of a later generation V weapon, America needed to learn about the V2. General Henry H. Hap Arnold, chief of the Army Air Corps, figured there was no better teacher than the men who designed it. Von Braun didn't know it, but America wanted him as badly as he wanted to end up in America. At the start of 1945, von Braun maintained appearances by working on advanced A4 variants, including a long-range winged version called the A4B, while his trunk remained packed and ready. He had his staff on the same alert. When the Red Army mounted an offensive at the German border with Poland, the sounds of gunfire and a feeling of chaos reached Peenemünde. Kammler ordered the entire rocket team to evacuate and hide in Bad Sascha, southwest of Berlin. He also ordered von Braun to go to Mittelwerk and oversee the factory there. A third set of orders told him and his team to stay in Peenemünde and fight the Allies to the death. Germany's leaders were falling into panic, paranoia, and desperation, and von Braun realized he could use it to his advantage. Back in 1943, after the raid on Peenemünde, Dornberger was transferred from the Army's Ordnance Department and promoted to the Army's Commissioner for Special Tasks, abbreviated in German to WWII. His official letterhead, however, had the acronym misspelled as WWII, which meant nothing. Von Braun's transportation coordinator, Erich Nimwegen, came up with a title that fit the acronym, Wir haben zur besonderen Verwendung, roughly Project for Special Disposition. Von Braun decided to trust that even the trigger-happiest SS officers wouldn't dare stop a top-secret unit of scientists moving with an SS major as their leader. The team painted WWII on cars, trucks, and rail cars, filled with boxes of documents and materials. The challenge was that Peenemünde had grown to a team of hundreds, some of whom had families. The first train to leave the site on February 17, 1945, held materials and 525 personnel. It was immediately stopped at an SS roadblock, but a flash of the WWII orders signed by SS Major von Braun did the trick, and the guards let them pass. While his team evacuated, von Braun traveled around Germany ostensibly looking for a new permanent rocket facility. It was during one of these trips that both von Braun and his driver fell asleep and woke up in an airborne car careening off a 40-foot-high embankment. Von Braun instinctively raised his left arm, which broke in the crash. He regained consciousness in a private hospital room in Bleicherode, his arm in a heavy cast. He was still confined to hospital on his 33rd birthday when he heard that the Allies had crossed the Rhine. Germany was falling fast, and a desperate Hitler called for all military, industrial, transportation, and communications facilities to be destroyed by the retreating Home Guard, the scorched earth policy. Better the Allies inherit a destroyed nation than learn any of the Reich's secrets. Kammler, meanwhile, moved the rocket team into hiding at Oberammergau, a village in the Bavarian Alps near the Austrian border. During the move, 2 Rocketeers took a detour to an abandoned mine in the Harz Mountains and buried 3 trucks worth of material in a cavern before dynamiting the tunnel closed. The Peenemünde team was settled in their new spot, von Braun still in a cast, when Kammler showed up on April 11th. He announced without hyperbole that he intended to single-handedly win the war for Germany. He transferred control of the rocket team to a Major Kummer, then left brandishing a pistol. Von Braun convinced Kummer that the rocket team was safer from airstrikes or Allied forces in 2 different locations. After a brief hospital visit to break and reset his arm in a new cast that kept it bent and raised at the shoulder, von Braun and Dornberger ended up at Haus Ingeberg, a mountain ski resort on the old German-Austrian border. They had a terrace overlooking the snow-capped Alps and a staff eager to cater to their every desire. They had a full wine cellar and radios to listen to the war's final denouement. The problem was, they were sitting ducks. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler took his own life in his bunker in Berlin. The rocket team heard on the radio on May 1st that the Fuhrer had died valiantly in combat against the Russian army. In any case, Hitler's death freed Germany's soldiers and also meant that career military men like Dornberger and von Braun were left in a bed of their own crimes. Rather than wait to be tried, they decided to find some Americans. On May 2nd, the war was declared over in Europe, and Magnus von Braun left Haus-Ingeberg on a bicycle. Magnus was sent out because he had some of the best English, and he wasn't so vital that his death would kneecap the team. Yes, Werner von Braun decided his own brother was expendable. Magnus rode toward Austria, and in less than 2 miles he found an American anti-tank platoon. It took almost half an hour of broken English for Magnus to convince the Americans that he really did have the rocket team nearby, which turned them very friendly. Magnus secured passes, and that night he, Werner, Dornberger, and 4 other men and their luggage went to the 44th Infantry's temporary command post in Reutte. They were greeted with a meal of eggs, white bread, butter, and the first real coffee they'd had in months. Von Braun was pleased but unsurprised by their friendly reception. He knew the Americans would want him and his work, and knew they'd be kept happy and healthy, which, if we pause and step back, is a hugely vain way to feel. But he knew he was more valuable alive and cooperative than jailed or dead, so they would treat him well. The Americans found the whole meeting baffling. Dornberger was the obvious leader as the most senior man, but he seemed like an old, defeated general. Then there was the 33-year-old von Braun, extremely jovial, and after his time at Haus-Ingeberg and forced inactivity because of his injury, possibly the only portly man in a starving country. He didn't fit the bill of the brilliant inventor of the V2. They legitimately wondered if he wasn't Germany's best con artist. But interviews in the days that followed made it clear that he was the real deal, and also that he had big thoughts on a war between the United States and the Soviet Union, one in which the Americans' best chance was arming itself with his rockets. Again, very presumptuous. His dreams of spaceflight only trickled out a little in these interviews. The Americans and the British who met with him were interested in his military potential. With the Germans' help, the Americans recovered everything from Peenemünde and the dynamite mine in the Harz Mountains. Then von Braun was tasked with picking the men he would bring to the United States under Project Paperclip. He wanted 520 and their families, but was forced to winnow it down to 124. His list did not include Dornberger. With von Braun poised to start a new chapter, let's pause for an ad break. The first recovered pieces of V2s arrived at the White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico in August of 1945. Eventually, 300 train cars full of hardware, rocket parts, instruments, documents, and warheads reached the desert. In December, Werner von Braun arrived and didn't find the America he'd dreamed of. The desert was dry and barren, and he didn't get the same warm reception as when he'd initially surrendered. As more Peenemünders arrived, they were assigned to various projects. Only 39 were put on Project Hermes, the U.S. program to get V2s flying. Hermes was a bit more than the V2. American engineers wanted to learn its systems to build anti-aircraft missiles, tactile missiles, and even multi-stage rockets that could send a payload higher than a single rocket. To this end, some of the recovered V2s were classified as bumper rockets, in this case mated to a Jet Propulsion Laboratory-built WAC Corporal as the upper stage. One test in 1949 saw a payload reach almost 250 miles, or 402 kilometers, which is about where the International Space Station orbits. It was the first time von Braun confirmed that multi-stage rockets were the path to spaceflight. But those multi-stage tests didn't get him any closer to exploring space. He didn't get close to much. None of the Germans did. While the Americans explored the A4, they waited. Von Braun passed the time outlining his vision for a human mission to Mars in Das Maus Project. The worsening conflict in Korea in the early 1950s finally brought the Germans into action. Once President Truman pledged American involvement, the United States needed new arms, and von Braun was called on to develop 2 new surface-to-surface missiles. His team was given a larger facility in Huntsville, Alabama, but first, the U.S. government had to make everything legal. Von Braun took a streetcar to Juarez, Mexico, accompanied by a guard, submitted his paperwork to the American consulate, had a chest x-ray, paid his $18 processing fee, and returned across the border with a stamp on his passport. His immigration countdown had begun. Von Braun arrived in Alabama as the Redstone Arsenal's Ordnance-Guided Missile Center's first director. His team had access to the best facilities in the country, including the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics' wind tunnels and government proving grounds to get the Redstone missile off the ground. There was also Jupiter, a long-range offshoot of the Redstone. The Jupiter A served as a test bed for the new system, and the Jupiter C was a composite re-entry vehicle designed to test the rocket's nose cone. The Army wasn't the only one in the missile game. The U.S. Air Force, minted as a standalone service branch in 1947, was working on the MX-1593, nicknamed Project Atlas, and another missile called Titan. The Navy was developing a rocket called Vanguard. Both were working with contractors that hadn't secured the most coveted Army contracts. Though immersed in missiles, spaceflight was always on von Braun's mind. At the first annual symposium on space travel held at the American Museum of Natural History's Hayden Planetarium in New York, he gave a talk about rockets for spaceflight. Later, during cocktail hour, an editor from Collier's magazine approached von Braun and confessed that he hadn't understood a word of his talk. The editor and scientist realized theirs was a joint problem. People didn't understand that spaceflight was feasible. So von Braun forged a partnership with Collier's, and the March 22, 1952 issue hit newsstands with one of Chesley Bonestell's now iconic paintings depicting a rocket staging with the Earth far below. The title, "Man Will Conquer Space Soon, Top Scientists Tell How," in 15 startling pages, led readers to a very accessible description, written by von Braun, of how to build an orbiting space station that would serve as a laboratory and jumping-off point for missions to the moon. 8 issues over 2 years teased out the topic, another major piece written by one of the founding members of the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, Willy Ley. The Collier stories caught Walt Disney's attention. At the time, he was building Disneyland, and part of the funding was through ABC. The network was financing the park in exchange for exclusive TV content showcasing everything Disneyland would offer in its 4 areas of Fantasyland, Adventureland, Frontierland, and Tomorrowland. Since Tomorrowland featured a ride along a simulated moonscape, Disney's production team reached out to Willy Ley to help make it accurate, and Ley brought von Braun into the fold. On March 9, 1955, the Man in Space episode of Disney's series debuted, and America met Wernher von Braun.
Problems to come. Take the present-day pressurized flying suit, for example. It has been designed for use at extremely high altitudes and is a forerunner of the suits we will wear when we make that trip to the moon.
He was an absolute hit. He was handsome. His German accent wasn't so strong that he was hard to understand or felt too foreign. He explained things clearly and gently in a way that resonated with viewers. The show mentioned his role in the V2 program, but skirted over his Nazi and SS affiliations. It's possible that Walt Disney's own anti-Semitic tendencies softened his feeling toward von Braun so soon after the war, but that's just my own opinion. Over 3 episodes, Disney teased out spaceflight's possible future and created a link between this exciting new era and Wernher von Braun for the American people. That link was about to be solidified. The space age began, I would say, on June 29, 1955, when the White House announced the United States' intention to launch a small satellite as part of the International Geophysical Year, a 55-nation study into solar phenomena over 18 months. The satellite announcement was hugely celebrated, so much so that the Soviet Union quickly announced it would also launch a satellite. On the U.S. side, a voting committee selected the U.S. Navy's Vanguard missile for the American shot. Some committee members recognized Vanguard wasn't as strong a program as the Redstone, but a major selling point was its lack of ties to the V2 or the German war effort. Not winning the IGY bid didn't stop von Braun from developing a satellite launch configuration that he could hide in the Army's bottomless bureaucracy. His stack called for scaled-down Sergeant rockets as the upper stages on an elongated Redstone first stage, 11 for the second stage, 3 for the third stage, and 1 for the fourth. It was easy to hide because swapping out the Sergeant on top for a dummy stage would stop it from going into orbit but be an excellent testbed for re-entry materials. And so, 5 Redstone Sergeant configurations were earmarked as re-entry testbeds. If the Navy failed and he was given the green light, his team could prep one for a satellite launch within 3 months. Von Braun's group pressed on at the Redstone arsenal. They started working on a new joint Army-Navy missile program called Jupiter, funding and personnel for which expanded the site. On February 1, 1956, it was rededicated as the Army Ballistic Missile Agency with von Braun as director. The new Jupiter was its priority. On September 16, 1956, one of the hidden orbit-capable Redstones was renamed Jupiter C to imbue it with the priority of the new Army-Navy program and stacked on the launch pad. The Army's excitement worried the Pentagon. They were convinced von Braun was sneaking a satellite onto the rocket, so sent an official to Cape Canaveral to check that the fourth stage was indeed loaded with structural elements and sand as ballast. They needn't have. The rocket lacked the attitude control system to send it into orbit. The dummy force stage was lofted to a peak altitude of 682 miles, or just under 1,100 kilometers. Again, for comparison, the ISS orbits at about 250 miles, or 402 kilometers. Von Braun had proof that his configuration could reach orbit. But the Soviets got there first with Sputnik on October 4th, 1957. Sputnik wasn't that technologically exciting, it just beeped, but it captured imaginations on both sides of the Cold War. The rocket was the real big deal. If that rocket could launch a small satellite into orbit, it could easily send a warhead across the ocean. Space became an arena of the Cold War, an arena that increasingly favored the Soviets after they launched the dog Laika on Sputnik 2 just a month later. The Soviets were clearly preparing for a human mission, and what that human might do in space was anyone's guess. America's official answer to Sputnik came on December 6 with the Vanguard TV3 launch. Weather was touch and go with strong winds, but the day calmed and Vanguard was a go. America watched the live TV broadcast as sparks from the pyrotechnic igniter appeared at the base, catching fire as the liquid oxygen and kerosene started to flow. The rocket rose unsteadily, then fell back down. A fuel system malfunction killed the thrust, and the rocket landed back on its engine before collapsing. The tanks ruptured, spilling fuel and oxidizer onto the ground that turned into an inferno that engulfed the pad. Somehow, in the brief moment of weightlessness before the rocket collapsed, the Vanguard satellite registered it was in space, ejected, and when the dust settled, was proudly transmitting its signal from a nearby puddle. In the wake of the very public failure, Eisenhower's science advisor James Killian recommended continuing Vanguard, but also giving the Army a launch window. Von Braun's team had 2 months to get a Jupiter-C out of storage and add a live force stage, the right guidance system, and a 30-pound satellite called Explorer 1. Von Braun's 3-day launch window opened on January 29th. On the evening of January 31st, 1958, he was in Washington at the Army's Communications Center at the Pentagon. If the launch was successful, he would need to be in Washington to speak to the press, so he couldn't be in Florida. There was no closed-loop television, so he had to follow the countdown via a teletype machine. It was a stressful setup. The teletype update came that the firing commands had started and then that the main stage had lifted off, but there was no confirmation for the stages working. They would know it worked depending on when they established communication with the satellite, if they did at all. The expected time for a signal from Explorer 1 came and went, marked by nothing but coffee, cigarettes, and donuts. The team was settling into defeat when word came from 4 tracking stations simultaneously on the West Coast that they had a signal. America's first satellite was in orbit. This is the picture of the 3 men most responsible for America's success that night. Dr. William H. Pickering of JPL, who'd built the satellite, Dr. James Van Allen, who designed and built the instruments on board, and Wernher von Braun, who built the rocket. This was the press conference at the National Academy of Sciences. This is the von Braun that Americans saw, jubilant over his success, representing his new home country. In the background of this very public satellite race, Lyndon Johnson was leading the country's policy response to Sputnik, while every military branch developed its own human spaceflight program. The flurry of activity ended with the National Aeronautics and Space Act creating a civilian agency, NASA, which brought all space-related programs together under one roof, separate from the military. Though it wasn't stated as such, NASA's goal was to launch an American into space before the Soviets launched one of their guys. Underpinning this new agency was the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, America's leading aviation research body that managed the most advanced wind tunnels and aviation programs like the X-15. The one thing NASA didn't have was rockets, and it immediately started eyeing Wernher von Braun. NASA moved faster in its earliest days than most people realize. Agency representatives were at the Redstone Arsenal on October 6th, less than a week after NASA became NASA, to discuss using the Redstone and Jupiter missiles as launch vehicles for what was then called the Manned Satellite Project. On October 7th, it announced that program would be called Mercury. In February of 1959, it awarded a contract for the Mercury spacecraft to the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation. On April 9th, it introduced the men that would fly in it. The pieces of the first program were in place. The Army agreed to make its resources available to NASA as needed, and even granted the space agency authority to bypass the Department of Defense in discussions with Huntsville. But it still wasn't ideal. NASA wanted von Braun. The Army didn't want to let him go, but space was a Cold War battlefield, and NASA won. The transfer created the Marshall Space Flight Center with von Braun as its director. He brought with him his team, a million-pound thrust rocket engine still under development, and a new family of rockets called Saturn. On July 29, 1960, NASA started letting study contracts for its next-generation spacecraft, provisionally called Apollo, that might go to the moon. In November, John F. Kennedy was elected president, and his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, was appointed as head of the National Aeronautics and Space Council. The Mercury program forged ahead against the backdrop of changing national leadership. Because no one knew what would happen to a human in space or how the body would react to microgravity, the missions would be simple. The first launches would be suborbital, going up and down like a popgun shot, which meant the rocket, specifically Von Braun's Redstone, was the crucial element. So it's not surprising that Wernher von Braun spent a lot of time with the astronauts, and I think how they recall him is very interesting for our conversation today. Deke Slayton remembers in his memoir that there was a very small group in the blockhouse the day NASA launched its first Redstone on November 21, 1960, a group that included the 7 astronauts and Von Braun. John Glenn recalls that Redstone inspections often took the 7 astronauts to Huntsville, where they went to Von Braun's house. As he wrote years later, the German-born engineer, then in his late 40s, was a handsome, broad-shouldered man with thick, dark hair. Von Braun had been a devoted Nazi during World War II. Whatever anyone thought of Von Braun's previous allegiances, he had a well-deserved reputation for heading an effective rocket team. His library showed him to be a man whose interests were not confined to rocket science. I wandered into the book-lined room expecting to find nothing but tomes on engineering, astronomy, physics, and other technical matters. There were many of those, but I was impressed to find even more extensive collections in fields such as religion, comparative religion, philosophy, history, and government. Both these recollections came decades later, after Von Braun had passed, but some astronauts shared their feelings during the early Mercury days. The 7 men had deals with Life magazine to tell their stories under their own bylines. In one of these articles, Gordon Cooper wrote about Von Braun, "I remember particularly 2 meetings which adjourned to the homes of Dr. Wernher von Braun and Dr. Jack Hootner in Huntsville, Alabama, where we sat and drank coffee and talked about space until the wee hours of the morning. Both of these men had given a great deal of serious thought to space since they were young students in Germany, and they were full of fascinating ideas about what can be done in space and what we may find out there." I bring up the astronauts' remembrances because they were the rock stars of the era. They're admittedly skewed, Slayton and Glenn writing years later, and Cooper likely had his manuscript checked by NASA Public Affairs before Life printed it. Regardless, their positive feelings and overall praise of Von Braun possibly helped shape public opinion, at least a little bit. It's also possible they were able to separate themselves from Von Braun's past. Of the 7 astronauts, only John Glenn had served during the Second World War. They had all served in Korea. They might have felt that Nazis weren't part of their own military history. There's only one instance where the astronauts had beef with Von Braun. On January 31, 1961, Ham the Chimp launched on a Redstone missile on a suborbital flight, exactly the same suborbital missions the astronauts would fly. It wasn't a good flight. The rocket didn't perform optimally, and the spacecraft was sent 42 miles, or 67.5 kilometers, higher and 125 miles, or 201 kilometers, further than planned. This came with a physical penalty. Ham pulled more than 7 Gs, or 7 times the force of gravity at launch. That was survivable. The 15 Gs he pulled on his too fast re-entry almost weren't. In training, the astronauts blacked out starting at about 16 Gs. The fast landing was so hard that a bolt was forced through the bulkhead and caused the spacecraft to leak. And because the landing was off target, it took recovery crews longer to collect the stressed-out chimp. Add to that issues of the onboard electronics, and Ham was a lot less happy after the flight than he seems in pictures. The Space Task Group wanted to go ahead with an astronaut on the next Redstone mission despite these issues, but Von Braun said no. He wouldn't allow it. He wanted one more Redstone test to make sure it was safe, which NASA granted, but labeled MRBD, Mercury Redstone Booster Development, to make it clear that it was Von Braun's mission and not something the agency felt it needed. MRBD also meant pushing back the first human mission, Al Shepard's flight, by a month. MRBD flew flawlessly on March 24, 1961, and Shepard was livid. Delaying his flight, he felt, had opened the door for the Soviets to get Yuri Gagarin into space first on April 12th. It's about the only negative story you hear about Von Braun from the era, but it's more frustration than real anger. Von Braun couldn't have known the Soviets were so ready to launch Gagarin when he requested the MRBD test, and it's likely that had Shepard gotten up first, the Soviets would still have said that suborbital doesn't count and claimed first man in space with Gagarin. Gagarin becoming the first human in orbit was the first embarrassment Kennedy suffered early in his presidency. The second was the absolute fiasco at the Bay of Pigs just days later. Al Shepard's flight on May 5th wasn't a salve on the wound. His 15 suborbital minutes weren't an orbit. Kennedy needed to save face. He put the task to Lyndon Johnson, who took the question to NASA, who said that the moon was feasible. Kennedy pledged a manned landing on the moon within the decade on May 25, 1961. Apollo was officially on the books on July 28th. Von Braun was delighted with Apollo's announcement, not just because going to the moon excited him personally, but also because the program would use his team's rockets, ensuring they had work for years to come. And the rocket, not all that indirectly, shaped the entire mission. How Apollo would go to the moon, the decision called the mission mode, was the first problem NASA had to solve on this journey. A spacecraft going to the moon is big. There's no appreciable atmosphere on the moon, so landing would have to be done by retro rockets, small rockets to slow the landing craft to a stop. This meant an upright landing, which was convenient because it was set up to launch again on its path back to Earth. It had to be since there were no ground crews to help. Landing on and launching from the moon both take fuel, which is heavy and had to be taken from Earth because the time frame of Apollo didn't allow for any exploration into mining materials to make fuel on the moon. This created a hugely heavy mission. One early proposal called for launching each piece of the spacecraft separately and assembling it in Earth orbit before going to the moon, a mode called Earth Orbit Rendezvous. This famous sketch, famous among nerds, shows that it could take up to 10 launches, though most proposals said it could be done with 2 smaller Saturn-class rockets, the C-1. That's insane. That's so many failure points in an era where spaceflight is still super new, not to mention assembling a spacecraft in orbit, properly rendezvous and docking, was a total unknown. So an arguably simpler option was to just go straight to the moon on a single rocket using a mode called direct ascent. Von Braun calculated that such a rocket would require around 12 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, provided by 8 engines from a massive rocket called Nova. This was insane in its own way. Nova was a massive technological leap from the rockets as they existed at the time. A third mode was the outlier. Pitched by engineer John Hubble, Lunar Orbit Rendezvous got away from the heavy lunar landing spacecraft by leaving the gas tank in orbit. If you don't land with the whole vehicle, you don't need to launch it again, so why not just land with a little purpose-built bug? It meant figuring out how to rendezvous and dock 2 spacecraft in the alien lunar environment, but this mission could fly on a single rocket smaller than Nova, von Braun's biggest Saturn-class rocket, the C-5. NASA eventually committed to Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, and with it, the Saturn V. To start things off, NASA also selected a smaller version, the Saturn 1B, to launch the Earth orbital Apollo missions. In either case, Apollo was riding on von Braun's skill. It was von Braun's Saturn V. He was firmly one of the space age's golden boys. As he gained more widespread fame, his past started to come back, just a little bit. In the 1960s, the French magazine Paris Match published a piece celebrating his genius that drew protests from Dora survivors. In a response in 1966, I felt ashamed that things like this were possible in Germany, even under a war situation where national survival was at stake. Von Braun never said anything directly about himself or his own actions. The incident did little to affect his status in the United States as Apollo neared the moon. Von Braun was, by then, among the top NASA managers, dining in private clubs in DC and rubbing elbows with the movers and the shakers. When the decision was made to go to the moon with Apollo 8 to make up time because the lunar module was behind schedule, the top players met in Von Braun's office in Huntsville to discuss whether the rocket was up to the challenge. When the early Apollo missions were successful, Von Braun pushed for the landing to be attempted earlier than planned, Apollo 11 instead of 12. He was in the blockhouse the morning Apollo 11 launched. Of course he was. It was his rocket going to the moon. He was right at the heart of Apollo as Apollo became emblematic of American technological dominance over the Soviet Union and an expression of American exceptionalism. And his importance didn't end with Apollo. The Apollo Applications Program started in 1966 to explore what other missions NASA could mount with Apollo hardware, and one of the big goals was a space station. There were 2 concepts, both of which used the Saturn V's third stage, the S-4B, as the basis. The first was a wet lab, launching the Saturn V and then turning the S-4B into a living quarters in orbit. The other was a dry lab, turning an S-4B into a full science lab on the ground and then launching it separately so it could be ready for arriving crews. It was Von Braun who championed for the dry lab, ensuring the station could meet science and human factors goals right off the bat. Walt Cunningham, who flew on Apollo 7 and moved to the Skylab program relatively early, recalls in his memoirs going to Huntsville to see early plans of the station and tearing them apart with Von Braun over lunch. One of the small benefits of Skylab was the opportunity for periodic contact with Wernher von Braun, one of the pioneers of rocketry and a man I had come to enjoy, admire, and respect. Von Braun was one of these people who could fill a room, a large man with great self-confidence. Von Braun was as important to the architecture of America's first space station as he was to the country landing on the moon. The press, the astronauts, the space agency all lauded von Braun for his work, which, as we've just seen, was both remarkable and pivotal for the Apollo-era programs that laid America's foundation in space. His past wasn't hidden, but it also wasn't discussed, kind of brushed away because he was useful to America, and the American shield was useful to him. He's linked to the creation of the A4, but not to its deployment as the V2. His own books were all forward-looking with plans for missions to Mars or more accessible looks at how spaceflight works and how the lessons from Apollo can apply to exploring other planets. But the people who'd suffered in the mines in the Harz Mountains wouldn't stay silent forever. But first, we're going to take another quick ad break. In 1970, NASA leadership asked von Braun to move to Washington and head the Strategic Planning Office. He left Huntsville for D.C., but didn't stay long. He retired from NASA in 1972 and worked for Fairchild Industries of Germantown, Maryland. He died in Alexandria, Virginia, on June 16, 1977. He only made a few statements in his later years. In 1969, in a witness statement in a trial against 3 former SS officers, he admitted he had seen the deplorable conditions at Mittelwerk. In a 1976 TV interview, he again kept himself out of wartime recollections. The work conditions at Mittelwerk were absolutely horrible. I saw the Mittelwerk several times, once while these prisoners were blasting new tunnels in there, and it was a pretty hellish environment. I'd never been in a mine before, but it was clearly worse than a mine. But his story doesn't end with his death. In the 1990s, former concentration camp prisoners came forward saying under sworn affidavits that von Braun had not only seen the conditions in Dora and Mittelwerk, he'd been part of the problem. One testimony comes from Jules Joannin, who was in the Buchenwald Dora camp. He said that sometime around early May 1944, he was struck by von Braun while the engineer was visiting the site. Historians note that this was around the time when von Braun was meeting about enslaved workers, so it could fit, and it's possibly symptomatic of his different treatment of prisoners. There's another story from around the same time about a prisoner named Charles Sadron who was fairly well cared for because he was a middle-aged physics professor and highly useful to the A4 program. Jules Joannin, a 22-year-old nobody, wouldn't have warranted the same care. A second major story, and the one most often cited, comes from Guy Morin, who gave a notarized testimonial in Cannes in 1995. He says that in the fall of 1944, he witnessed von Braun order another prisoner flogged for a sabotage attempt over a missing chronometer. The dates bring the testimony into question for historians. In September of 1944, von Braun assigned his younger brother Magnus as his special liaison to Mittelwerk for servomotor production, the department where this incident happened. The timing aligns with Magnus's assignment, and Morin's testimony doesn't give the von Braun in question a first name. Historians think that this von Braun was Magnus and not Werner. Another survivor, Robert Casabun, said he saw von Braun stand by as prisoners were hanged. Adam Kabala, who survived Buchenwald, claims von Braun went to camps himself to pick out laborers. One thing historians point to with all these testimonies is a pretty obvious question. Why did these survivors wait until the 1990s, when von Braun had been dead for 20 years and the war over for 50, to come forward with their stories? Why not bring it up when he was NASA's golden child, or when he was at least still alive and could answer for the charges? It's odd timing to bring out notarized testimonials. There's also the problem that 50 years is a long time. It's hard to discern whether they remember the right man or if they filled him into their memories because of his fame. Unfortunately, the testimonies are hard to line up with von Braun's verified movements. Von Braun never made any definitive statements. His official biographers, Ernst Strelinger and Frederick Ordway, relate a story in their 1996 book that von Braun was threatened with a striped uniform if he said anything negative about what was happening in connection with Mittelwerk, but there's no direct anecdote from him to back this up. And the hardest part about these testimonials is that by the time they came out, von Braun's image was pretty solidified. He'd had 50 years to point to the airtight defense of his actions, his fear of rearrest. As I said earlier, von Braun's arrest might be the most important and luckiest thing that happened to him. If we want to simplify this in modern verbiage and give him the least charitable reading, it gave him the perfect opportunity to play the victim. In that sense, his arrest was absolutely an asset. It gave him a shield. It gave him an event to point to and say, look, the regime arrested me. I wasn't one of them. Coupled with the multiple asks for him to join the SS and coercion to join the Nazi Party, it paints the picture of a man who didn't want to be involved with the Nazis' practices, but had to go along with it, and who was thrilled to leave his traumatic past behind. Which leaves him, I think, in the most realistic spot. He was hugely opportunistic. Not really immoral. I don't think he loved seeing prisoners die for the sake of his rockets, but he also wasn't willing to risk his neck to defend them and risk harming his work. He's deeply amoral, void of decisions about right and wrong in favor of his self-interest. His guiding principle, which I think can be argued governed his moral compass as well, was his obsession with spaceflight. And he was so celebrated that he didn't really need to develop anything beyond that love of spaceflight. And we saw going back to the Second World War that he didn't hate a celebrity status. He was lauded in Germany for his rocketry skill, and the same privileged treatment followed him to America. People argued then, as they do now, that he wasn't a real Nazi, that he did what he had to do. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure he was selfless enough to risk his neck to do the right thing. A lot of people would say they'd stand up for injustice, and a lot of people would, but that's easier said than done. Performative action is very real when the party in question stands to gain from it, so let's think about von Braun in this context. If he'd spoken out about the mistreatment of prisoners at Dora or Mittelwerk, he wouldn't have died a martyr's death. He wouldn't be lauded in the history books as the brilliant engineer tragically murdered because he did the right thing. He'd be a footnote. Kammler would have kept the concentration camp labor flowing, the V2 would have gotten off the ground, and some other engineer would have ended up in America with enough technical knowledge to help the Americans get satellites off the ground. Wernher von Braun, had he spoken out, would probably be someone only World War II enthusiasts and rocket nerds would know about, kind of like how they know about Walter Dornberger. How many of you still watching this video have forgotten about him? As important as he was to the A4 program, Dornberger has largely become a footnote in popular retellings. But to close his story, he was tried for war crimes, imprisoned for a few years, then moved to America in 1947, where he worked on some space-adjacent programs. Wernher von Braun, I think we've seen, was not the type to let himself become a footnote. So back to the original question. How should we treat a Nazi? Not ignoring their past and acknowledging crimes against humanity is a start, but humans don't always think like that. I think von Braun's story highlights that in times of war and high tension, which World War II and the space race certainly were, morality takes a holiday. It's easier and often feels better to turn a blind eye to unsavory parts of someone's actions or past if they also inspire awe and speak to progress. Or, frankly, if they become really useful. The thing with von Braun is he's not unique in this regard. Yes, he's unique in his specific history and background, but is he that different from tech giants today? His overwhelming amorality and laser focus on spaceflight feels similar to the bottom-line focused companies and tech giants who aren't thinking about the repercussions of the things they're building. Big developments in science and technology often come with moral and political responsibilities. AI is a big one that stands out to me right now, a technology plenty of people will use even knowing that it plays a huge part in public misinformation, destroying people's livelihood, and has a devastating ecological impact. But people turn a blind eye to that because it makes reading an article easier, or because they want to make YouTube content but don't want to think of an idea and write it. AI has some incredible applications, but killing art and creativity in the name of hustle culture so we can be the people from WALL-E is about the worst use, and it feels like that's where we're going. And no one's answering for these huge negatives. The engineers coding it, the politicians not regulating it, and the companies footing the bill aren't held responsible for what's come from their work. I'm going to end with Michael Neufeld here because he puts it so beautifully succinctly. If the human race is to survive its own rapidly advancing technology in the 21st century and beyond, scientists and engineers will have to take moral and political responsibility for their actions, something Wernher von Braun and his colleagues signally failed to do. That's going to do it for me for today. If you stuck with me this far, I hope this not only clarified a few things about von Braun, but helped put him into context in the modern day. If you've enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to give the video a like and the channel a sub. It really helps me grow in the landscape that's increasingly saturated with the aforementioned AI content. Huge shout out to my members and patrons who make it possible for me to keep working on these giant videos, and also the shorts that keep things active between these videos. Okay, be mindful out there everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.